Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I shall just start off by saying that obviously the subject of today's webinar is Tawang's linkages with Bhutan. The broad subject of trans-Himalayan people-to-people cultural contact and their varied engagements with each other is obviously a very fascinating one. This is a subject that straddles the modern political frontiers of states. Many of today's borders embody linear legacies of empire and reflect the territorialization of the globe during the 19th century's colonial era. But as Kyle Gardner says in his latest book, The Frontier Complex, boundaries and borderlands, whether real or imagined, are spaces and ideas produced over time through practices and structures rooted in conceptions of space, geography, and territory. In fact, he talks even of cosmologies that are far from linear. It was the colonial state that tied geography intimately to the particular demands of security. It reflected a geopolitical vision of what he describes as a set of coterminous territories tied to and dependent upon geographic features. Now, while British India distinguished between the administrative, military, and strategic frontiers of India, in the tribal areas of the periphery, its general policy, that is British India's general policy, had been to avoid excessive intervention or accept responsibilities more than required to maintain a minimum degree of administrative order and political stability in the region. In Northeast India, the interactions with frontier tribes were regulated by providing for what they call an inner line, beyond which foreigners could not cross without a permit, and an outer line which indicated the external territorial frontier. Obviously, this has been subject to a lot of discussion. The tribes were not to cross the inner line, attack or cause disturbances inside the British side. But beyond that, except for occasional punitive expeditions against marauding or intractable elements, the tribes were left largely to their devices. Now, social anthropologists like Nimi Kurian, etc., however, stress the need for what they call a teleological reading of the Himalayas as a self-contained, bounded territorial space. To use them, she says, as misleading metaphors like natural frontiers, barriers, or bulwark, actually serve only to flatten a rather complex, mobile, ethno-cultural landscape and undermine the role that the Himalayan borderlands have historically played as a territorial interface. Now, more recently, Professor Swargajyoti Guhai, has used the notion of imagined geography to understand new forms of cultural identity in the Himalayan region. She talks of not only physical geography, but imagined geography for building up what she calls new circuits of belonging. And in the Tawang region, she says this will include not only the Monpas living in Monyul, but also Buddhist people from surrounding Himalayan regions as a whole, such as Sikkim, Bhutan, and even Nepal. Guhai sees such a Himalayan imagined geography as covering politically discontinuous units spread across the entire Himalayas in a manner that reflects the contours of a kind of post-national geography without specific territorial character. Now, obviously, this can get very difficult when this comes actually face-to-face with the political realities of the current day. In a region that is culturally connected, it is hard to keep people apart and divided. But when psychological and mental barriers get erected and the governments begin to speak of threats from across the border, particularly when there are no boundaries delimited or agreed to, as it were, it is natural that we begin to view people from the other side of the border with suspicion. This is becoming true of our area in a very, very significant way today. The nationalist and populist rhetoric of the different South Asian states also create, not just South Asian, obviously even our neighbor, also creates mental barriers through state-sponsored propaganda as well as through social media and other means. The question, of course, is, will we ever be able to transcend these barriers even while we speak of a globally connected world? Now, Tawang's linkages with Tibet are well known. The linkages that Tawang has shared with Bhutan, however, have not been investigated very much. We have not so far devoted much attention to understanding these linkages within a more complex trans-Himalayan landscape, as it were. And this is where Professor Sonia Shukla has actually developed particular expertise, and she proposes to do precisely this today. As distinct from those who argue that the region known as the Tawang Tract is disputed and that Tibet draws its claim to the region unambiguously, Professor Shukla makes the point that while Tibet has had a huge impact on the shared culture of the region, the issue of territorial rights in the modern sense does not draw directly from these linkages. This is a point which I think would be very interesting to all of us. As Rija has just introduced Dr. Sonia Shukla, who is from OP Jindal Global University, I shall not give many details except to say that she has lived in Arunachal Pradesh in the West Kameng and Tawang districts close to China and traveled across Arunachal researching official and oral history accounts. She has been obviously, as a journalist and editor, as well as a scholar and teacher, she has involved herself in both the nitty-gritty as well as the deep historical backgrounds. She's also written on subjects like India's fight against terrorism, the rise of fundamental forces in the region. So you can expect a very broad-based kind of background in her. Now, before I ask Professor Sonia Shukla to make her presentation, she has suggested that she will make some preliminary comments on the recent situation and then go to her major arguments, after which we will have our question and answer session. Dr. Shukla, would you like to get straight away to the... I'll give you the floor straight away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Nambiar, for that very generous sort of introduction and also leading us into the commentary that I am going to give. That was the perfect introduction that I could have asked for. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be speaking at the Institute of Chinese Studies, albeit virtually this time. When I had proposed my subject for today, it seemed like I was going to talk mostly of the past. But given the events of the past few days, it would be a shame not to discuss the present too. So I'll make a few submissions that we can take up in the discussion later, as Ambassador Nambiar said, perhaps in the question and answer session. My submission is, Bhutan and China have had 24 rounds of boundary talks. They have had 10 rounds of meetings at the expert group level. These negotiations follow the 1988 joint communique on the guiding principles for the settlement of the boundary between Bhutan and China, and the 1998 agreement on the maintenance of peace, tranquility, and status quo on their border areas. But most recently, a memorandum of understanding on a 3-step roadmap for expediting the China-Bhutan boundary negotiation was signed virtually on 14th October 2021. The timing of this MOU has raised concerns in New Delhi because it comes when India-China relations are really at a low. The border talks on the 17-month-old standoff at the line of actual control in Ladakh appear to have hit an impasse. Given the current climate, China is using the MOU to embarrass India. That's to be expected. Everything in the Chinese media, from Global Times to all the other television channels, all the other writing that we are seeing that is coming out of Beijing, seems to suggest that Beijing is using this to make a point to New Delhi about how it is getting isolated in its own neighborhood. But is that all that there is to the story? I have been speaking to my sources in Bhutan, people who are quite close to the establishment, I shall add. And they believe that there is no reason to believe that Bhutan that there is any malintent in Bhutan. They say that this MOU has been negotiated from April 2021 onwards. And there is no reason to believe that India did not know about it. It was agreed at the 10th expert group meeting in Kunming in April this year. It is done to expedite the ongoing boundary negotiations. And India was kept in the loop throughout, I have been given to understand. Bhutan's ambassador to India, General Wetsop Namgyal, and China's ambassador to India, Sun Weidong, were also present at the virtual meeting. Bhutan and China don't have diplomatic missions, as we know, in each other's country, and they liaise through their embassies in New Delhi. The boundary negotiations between China and Bhutan, as we have said, are hardly new. The engagement began in 1984. The border between China and Bhutan till the late 70s was considered an extended part of the Sino-Indian border dispute, and Bhutan had formally not engaged with China. But since 1984, talks between Bhutan and China have largely focused on two separate areas of dispute, which includes Doklam and other areas in Bhutan's west near the India-China-Bhutan tri-junction, measuring about 269 square kilometers there, and in the Jakarlung and Pasamlung valleys located near Tibet to Bhutan's north, which measure about 495 square kilometers. Doklam has been an area of concern for India, especially since the military standoff in 2017. But even more significantly for India, and more recently, at the Global Environment Facility meeting in June 2020, China laid claim to Sakteng, which is an area that borders Tawang. And as we know, China has been claiming Tawang now for a long time. It was, at the time, it was seen as a tactic to pressurize the Indian government to bring Bhutan to the table for the negotiations. Bhutan very categorically refuted the Chinese claim. They totally rejected it and said, in the minutes of the council meeting say that the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary is an integral and sovereign territory of Bhutan, and at no point during the boundary discussions between Bhutan and China has it featured as a disputed area. This is the first time China laid claim to that area, which spans about 740 square kilometers. It is a wildlife sanctuary in Bhutan, in fact, and it had never featured in any of the boundary talks between Bhutan and China. Nor was it a part of the two boundary surveys that the countries conducted in 2013 and 2015. Now, given the sensitivity between India and China on the question of Bhutan, on the question of Tawang, I beg your pardon, this is likely another Beijing tactic to put pressure on India. So what are the linkages between Bhutan and Tawang that make these areas vulnerable to Chinese claims? South Asia has a rich oral tradition, and a lot of our research, that is the research that I did with my co-author Ajay Shukla, has centered on oral history accounts and local documents, as also on folklore. Folklore is such an important part of the Indian tradition and the South Asian tradition that to ignore folklore in understanding regions, I think, is a mistake. Karma Funsho is a Bhutanese scholar who is based in Cambridge University in the UK, and he has written The History of Bhutan, which is the first ever attempt to cover the entire history of Bhutan in some detail in English. Unlike Michael Aris, he combines both the traditional perspectives as well as the modern academic analysis. He brings both to it. The Tawang region in Arunachal Pradesh has traditionally been known to draw its linkages from Tibet. Its ethnicity and religious practices are derived directly from Tibet. And until 1951, even the administration of the area was done through the ecclesiastical dispensation headed by the Dalai Lama, who ruled from Lhasa. This is well known and documented, as Ambassador Nambyar said, but what has remained somewhat covered in a shroud in the history studies of the region are the linkages that Tawang has shared with Bhutan and how it forms a part of the larger Himalayan culture. And that is what I will submit to you today. Through the centuries, Tawang and the adjoining areas have had commercial, religious, cultural, and even colonial relations with Tibet. It has an equally long and cherished association with Bhutan that is recounted in local folklore and in historical accounts. I'll start with the ancient folklore, because as we lived in Dirang and Tawang, and as you drive around those valleys, people tell this story like it's a household tale. They claim that in the 6th century, there was a king in Tabang. He was called Kalawangpo. He had a fortress in another village called Thembang, which is not very far from Dirang, who ruled over the area stretching from Tawang to Kalaktang, which is further south. Now, this entire area runs along the Bhutan-Arunachal border from Tawang to Kalaktang. The Geshe in Buddhist philosophy at the Tawang monastery told us his story. He said Kala Wangpo had two wives. The older wife was called Hashang Gyalmo. She was from Zimithang, which is now a village close to the LAC. And the younger one was called Drova Zangmo. She was from Lagyari in the West Kameng district. The older wife plotted to have the son and daughter of the younger wife murdered after the king and the younger queen had passed on. In a fairy tale twist, both children escaped into Bhutan, and the son, Lase Gyalpo, came to rule the area around Merak in today's Bhutan, just adjacent to Tawang. According to local legend, 1100 years later, a Lama from Merak built the Tawang monastery in exactly the same place where the palace of King Gyalpo Kalawangpo had stood. We'll talk a little bit more about the Tawang monastery soon, because that has its linkages to Bhutan as well, post Kalawangpo. Till the 16th century, Bhutan was part of Tibet, and of great importance religiously and culturally. It was a learning center. This was also the time when various political interests were vying for supremacy in Tibet. The Kagyu Karmapa, the head of the Kagyu sect of the Buddhists, they are called the Red Hats, colloquially, and not in such a nice way, but the Red Hats. They led the Drukpas, who came from the learning centers in the Bhutan area. And they were patronized by the Sang kings who ruled in the western part of central Tibet. At the time, the Kagyu order in Tibet was replaced by the Gelugpa order, which won primacy by forging alliances with Mongol warlords and defeating the other Buddhist orders. Now, how did this happen? The Gelug school, the one that the Dalai Lama belongs to, was founded by the Tsongkhapa in the 14th century. He lived between 1357 and 1419. And he established the Ganden Monastery in 1409 to the north of Lhasa. This school gained religious prestige as well as social and political power. It achieved ascendancy when the fifth Dalai Lama became the supreme leader of Tibet by garnering Mongol support. Thus, the Gelug school of Buddhism gained political power to rule over Tibet for the next 400 years as a theocratic state. As the Kagyu sect was displaced from its high place in southern Tibet, a faction of the sect decided to form a separate country, and they called it Druk, which is a bit different from the jam that we used to eat as children. This was in the 1630s. And it is interesting to note that, we were forming countries even before the Peace of Westphalia was written in 1648. Tibet obviously didn't like this. The Gelugpa school had little influence in mainland Bhutan, and with Mongol might backing them, Lhasa turned its guns on Bhutan and decided to bring it back under the direct influence of Tibet. The two fought a series of wars over high mountains in the second half of the 17th century. One of the main areas where the struggle for religious and political influence raged in the 17th century was in eastern Bhutan and in Tawang. Karma Phuncho in the History of Bhutan says, in far eastern Bhutan, Lobsang Tanpe Dronme, a student of the first Dalai Lama, established a few centers. However, they were also taken over by the forces of the Drukpa school during the campaign to integrate eastern regions under Drukpa rule in the 17th century. But some Gelug influence continued in the regions adjoining Tawang, especially in areas like Merak and Sakteng. You can see why the Chinese are very interested in these areas. At the dawn of 18th century, Bhutan was formally on the map, and Tawang had successfully resisted the religious and political integration into it. But we'll talk a little bit more on how it came to be at that point. Through the ages, the people who live in eastern India, in the areas surrounding Tabang and central Bhutan, were both referred to as Mon. We know of the Monpas in India, but even the people of Bhutan were called Mon. The reference originated among the Tibetans, who referred to their southern subjects as Mon, which basically means the darker people of the south. Mon is a basic ethno-regional marker in Tibetan culture, with a wide variety of meanings. In modern colloquial language, it refers to the Cis Himalayan region in general, and in most references, it includes Bhutan. This region, including Monul, was traditionally known as Lo Mon, which means southern Mon in Tibetan. Bhutan's old name was Lo Mon Khazi, which means the southern Mon of the four approaches, which were the four Mon valleys. They were Paro, Bumthang, Kurto, and Tawang. So the first three are today a part of Bhutan, but despite attempts to integrate it into the state, Tawang has remained in India. How did this happen? As we know, the state of Bhutan came into being in the face of Tibetan military attempts to sabotage it. In this struggle, the Tawang Monpas cast their lot with the more powerful and established kingdom of Tibet, rather than their smaller and relatively new neighbors to the west. Unlike other peripheral Tibetan peoples, the Monpas lived under the direct rule of the Tibetan state soon after its formation in 1642. According to Tibetan scholars, Monyul, as it is understood today, came into being through the military campaigns waged by the Ganden Pochrang state, which is what the Buddhist state was called. The ecclesiastical government of Tibet was known as the Ganden Pochrang, against the emerging Drukpa state from 1644 to 1714. Its people were determined to defend their land against their neighbors to the west and resisted incorporation into Bhutan. They did this by forging an alliance with Ganden Pochrang and its Mongol army, which used the Drukpa aggression, which in turn used the Drukpa aggression against the Monyul as a pretext for military intervention in Bhutan. The chief protagonist of this alliance, like many of the charismatic political figures of that time, was a Lama. He was called Lodro Gyatso, a native of the Merak region, which is in Bhutan, now in the Trashigang district of Bhutan. Merak Lama's forces attempted to incorporate the Merak region into the Monpa area of influence, but failed to hold it against the Drukpa. Bhutan, under its founding leader, Zabdrung, had already withstood 3 invasions from the Sangpa rulers of Tibet and managed to beat back Tibetan assaults. They carried on an expansion campaign to the east. What I'm trying to give you is the tussle that happened till the borders kind of settled down. Managed to beat back Tibetan assaults. They carried on their expansion campaign to the east that finally halted short of Tawang. This assault was guided by Lama Namse, who based himself in Kaling and collected taxes from there. But his rule was threatened when a rebellion supported by the Tibetan government and the Mon soldiers from the east laid siege to the castle in Kaling. At one point, at one stage in 1654, the eastern region of Trashigang was taken over by the Gelugpa forces. The control did not last long, but the Monpas and their Tibetan allies continued to take the fight into Bhutan till it came to a close when a new fort was built in Trashigang. This was the end of active hostilities, but the acceptance of an actual border between Tawang and Bhutan was still some years away. Merak Lama, the one who formed the Tawang monastery, was a personal disciple of the 5th Dalai Lama, the spiritual founder of the Ganden Pochrang and a champion of the Gelugpa school in a region otherwise dominated by the Drukpas. Further south, even in Dirang, the Nyingma sect dominates even today, and the Bon schools. He founded the great monastery of Tawang in 1681 as a bastion of the Gelugpa political and religious order in a hostile frontier on the authorization of the Lhasa government. It was a political act to found this monastery, not so much a religious one. The 5th Dalai Lama's 1680 edict sealed the annexation of the Tawang tract to the northern stretch of Monyul governed from Sonazong, forming an administrative region under the joint political and religious authority of the Sonazong Pon and the Merak Lama. Merak Lama, who founded the Tawang monastery, obviously came from Merak in Bhutan. He went to study at the feet of the 5th Dalai Lama. He was his star student at the Sera and Drebung monasteries. He was born a Kagyu. He became a Gelugpa and came back to establish a Gelug monastery fortress. The Tawang monastery, when you go to it and you see it, looks more like a fortress than a regular monastery on the border of Bhutan. This was quite a coup at the time to hold the border areas in 1681. The 5th Dalai Lama's edict is there in Michael Harris's essay for anybody who's interested in reading it. He clearly loved him like a son, and some people thought he might even have been one. In a move that was typical of the religio-political links traditionally cultivated by Tibetan rulers to promote the cohesion of peripheral regions with the center, Tawang's integration was immediately followed by a child called Sangyang Gyatso from Urjiling in Tawang being recognized as the sixth Dalai Lama. So it was, again, one of those things about integrating peripheral territories. How do you do that? So as you want to strengthen your influence in those areas, a young newborn child is declared the Dalai Lama. The strategic importance of Tawang for the Ganden Pochang rulers of Tibet was immense, because it was really, it was the rice bowl. It's where most of their taxation came from. To the extent that the sixth Dalai Lama was born in the Nyingma sect, and he was not a Gelugpa till he was trained. But they didn't seem to care for any of that. But as a result of that, Mon Tawang remained a solid, loyal enclave under the Tibetan rule for 250 years, right up to 1951, till Major Khateng went and released it. The sixth Dalai Lama did not live long, and his death was followed by a period of civil war in central Tibet. By the time Ganden Pochang rule was re-established in 1728, its wars with Bhutan were over, and the southern part of Monyul, now known as the three valleys below the passes, formally constituted as part of the of an administrative structure. After the formation of the Drukpa state, the term Monpa in Tibetan came to refer specifically to the inhabitants of Monyul and the tribal people from Tabang and Dirang valleys. They continued to be called Monpas even today. But this exercise in map making did not alter people's behavior in the region. Now, that's something that, we often lose sight of. So although these wars happened, these maps were made, these borders were created, but it didn't change people's lives. The 20th century wars do that. And that is what has been tragic for the local populations in that region. The people of Eastern Bhutan, those who live in Merak and Sakteng, continue to share a lot in common with the people of Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh. They dress similarly. They use the same madder dyes for clothes. They even use that very distinctive hat, which is made up of yak felt. They have these little ropes of yak felt that come out of the hat, and they keep the rain from running onto the face. They make the rain run off you. It's a very, very interesting piece of headgear. The people of Tawang and Eastern Bhutan share a language, which is known as Dakpakha or Northern Monpa. Traders from Eastern Bhutan and from Tawang and the Panchen area, which lies to the west of Tawang at the Tri-Junction, traveled to Sona to buy yak butter. They used to trade all the time. They would buy wool, dry meat of a yak, dry fish, salt was very important. Most often it was barter trade, and the exchange of money, although documented, was not extensive. Like in Bhutan, the general movement of people in Arunachal Pradesh too, that's another similarity, is largely north to south. People don't travel laterally across valleys from east to west. That is how the mule tracks run, and that's how people move. Trade routes in Bhutan followed the same trajectory, and a route has existed along Trashigang and Tashi Yangtze to Tawang, and then to Tibet in the north, and to other parts of India in the south. Apart from the ethno-cultural linkages, Tawang was also a key transit point for trade. Traders from Bhutan often traveled through the Tawang tract to reach the markets in Sona and Lhasa. Since Tawang was practically treated as a Tibetan colony, produce from Tawang was taxed at very high rates in Lhasa and in Sonazong. In the Shoksan village on the LOC, elderly locals tell us stories of the time when traders from Tawang pretended to be Bhutanese because the traders of Bhutan were exempt from taxation. Many Tawang traders would try and pass off as staff, as porters of Bhutanese businessmen, and they carried their own produce into markets in Sona and Lhasa to evade the taxes. Those were the main trading posts. The fairs took place usually in the summer months. According to a Tawang village elder, Karma Wangchu, the business fairs were held in Tibet in the months of May for 2 days, in June for 5 days, and in July for a whole fortnight. There are old families from Bhutan in Tawang tract who moved here almost 7 generations ago. They were settled here. Lungten Sering is a direct descendant from a Bhutanese family which fell on the Monpa side of the demarcation after Bhutan came into being. The family was rewarded with a large chunk of land, and they became zamindars, who were then exempt from all forms of Tibetan taxation. He told us all was free in Tibet for us. There was no tax. We didn't need to stop and pay at checkposts, and we were even exempt from paying taxes to the Tawang Gompa and the Zongpon. In fact, we could collect taxes on our own land till 1975. These documents have been renewed up to the 13th Dalai Lama. Obviously, local people from Tawang did not have the same privileges as the direct subjects in Lhasa did, or the sovereigns from Bhutan did. While this pattern of life became firmly entrenched in Tawang, wheels of the world continued to move slowly but surely towards a new dispensation. The 9th, 10th, 11th, and the 12th Dalai Lamas were all murdered as minors. These were mysterious killings that are not clearly spelled out in Tibetan history. The regent continued to rule over Tibet, but the state was weakened and the dominance of the Qing dynasty was felt in the Ambans, who were the resident representatives in Lhasa of the Chinese court. This was why the 13th Dalai Lama was such a powerful figure, because he became a major and he saw the Qing dynasty become weaker. And it was he who traded Tawang to the British in exchange for Tibet becoming an independent country. The McMahon line was drawn as a result of several factors coming together during the pre-World War I years: the Tibetan nationalism, British rivalry with the Russians, the collapse of the Qing dynasty. But according to local accounts, travel continued between Bhutan, Tibet, and the Tawang Tract right till into the 1950s. The flight of the Dalai Lama in 1959 that resulted in the Chinese forces coming up to the border with Arunachal Pradesh and Bhutan curtailed travel severely between India and Tibet and between Bhutan and Tibet. And of course, after 1962, all border trade and all border transit was closed. According to myriad accounts of the 1962 war, most retreating soldiers in the war who survived came through Bhutan. They walked through those rhododendron forests. There are some very vivid accounts by some officers and soldiers who escaped the Chinese onslaught through Bhutan. After the war, the Tibet border was completely closed to traffic. The India-Bhutan border, on the other hand, is well policed and demarcated and continues to see a regular flow of traffic and ideas through the traditional routes over mountain passes. It's not unusual to meet people in Dirang, in Tabang, in Mago, in those areas who have crossed over and who have relations across and do go and visit them without any problems, really, apart from those that are posed by the geography of the area. Recently, as part of a trekking group on the Bailey Trail in the Tawang sector of Arunachal Pradesh, in which Ambassador Sham Saran was with us, the working party included a boy from Bhutan. There were 2 Monpas from Arunachal and 2 Sikkimese Bhutia boys. All 5 of them understood each other perfectly well, although they spoke different languages. Their explanation to us was their languages are so similar that they are easily comprehensible to one another. These are the interlinkages that play out even today in the Eastern Himalayas. And at the end, I will submit once again that for those who argue that the region known as the Tawang Tract is disputed and that Tibet draws its claim to the region unambiguously, this study of Tawang's historical linkages to Bhutan, I hope, attempts to illustrate the cultural connections that exist all along the Himalayas. Tibet had a huge impact on the shared cultures of the region, but the issue of territorial rights in the modern sense cannot draw, in my view, and I hope others are convinced, from those linkages. Thank you very much for your time and for your patient hearing. I will hand you back over to Ambassador Nambiar.
Thank you, Sonia. That is a fascinating but very swift kind of a trek around almost across several centuries. And I think you brought some very interesting points. I don't know whether I can straight away ask you a question, but I'll hazard that. You mentioned basically only Bhutan, and I suppose that has been the main subject of your research. Has there been any linkages, any connections across Bhutan onto even on the Sikkim side, which you may have seen in any, or was that far too different in terms of the linkages and perhaps even of the connections which may have been made between the people. Because when you talk about the Himalayan region as a whole, there have been, I suppose, linkages, but as you said, since the tracks were basically north-south, it would probably have to go up to Tibet and then back, or down into the valley and then back again up. It wouldn't have been laterally. And that would have been one of the major constraints, clearly. But apart from that, would there be anything you would like to comment on in terms of the broader linkages across the entire landscape of the sort of this trans-Himalayan landscape, which could help us understand a little more of this kind of context? Obviously, there have been, as you said, the basic red hat, yellow hat differences as between Tibet and Bhutan has been there. But Sikkim is again a slightly different kind of configuration, and that itself would probably, suggest certain direct linkages with Tibet. But anyway, I was wondering whether you had any comments like that to make straight away, and then meanwhile we will look at if there is anybody raising questions. Rija, if you can probably, or Venkat, if you can find out, you can tell me.
Yes. I'll just to answer what you were saying. I think Swargajyoti's work does allude to it, and I think that work gives us some indication that yes, they existed all across the Himalaya.
Yes.
I have worked mostly on Bhutan and Tawang because of my interest and my research in Tawang. But clearly, even from the very anecdotal information that we got in our trek on the Bailey Trail from these young people who came from Sikkim, Bhutan, and Tawang, and were clearly being able to speak to each other. And they said that there are so many similarities. They seem to say that, and they live these similarities. I have no reason to doubt them. So I think that that's something that could be researched as well. But I think you have what you say about Sikkim, I think its connections to Chumbi Valley would probably be more relevant. Whereas this part of Tibet, which had its connections to the Sonazong and to Lhasa, might be slightly different. I think in terms of the granular differences.
Yes. Questions now. I think Colonel Virendra Varma has posted a question in the chat box. He says, he was posted in Tawang. How have Monpas taken Chinese claims of Tawang? That is his question.
Should I answer it?
Why don't you, while we look at the others, is there anybody who's raising his hand? I don't see much of a raised hands so far.
If you'd like me to go ahead, I can answer.
Yes,
that.
Go ahead, please.
Other people are able to type their questions, perhaps. I think that the Monpas actually did not take the Chinese claim of Tawang very well at all. They are all Buddhists, and the Monpas themselves had a very difficult relationship with the Tibetans, because the Tibetans were sort of their overlords. And these people were treated, and even by their name, they were called the darker people of the South, and were treated more, they had a more sort of a colonial arrangement. And therefore, they weren't very happy. And it was made worse. When we were there, we still heard accounts after all these years that when the Dalai Lama came back, he went through these areas in 1959 when he came to India. From Tawang, he drove on horses, walked, etc. And, he was their God. He was their deity. And that the Chinese had been so cruel and awful to him had a huge impact on their psychology. And therefore, the Chinese claim to Tabang, and which is why in 1962, even though the Indian administration, the armed forces, had evacuated, had left, the people were not taken in by the Chinese when they came in.
This is Berenice mentions this very much in her book also.
Yes. Yes. And
they remembered particularly the help given during the 1950 earthquake also by the Indian side. Yes.
By the Indian administration. Yes. Absolutely. Yes.
Mr. Venkatraman has a question, and he says, has any study been carried out on the traditional grazing areas of Monpa villages, which have now spilt over the current borders or boundaries?
So, in fact, Ajay and I are working on a book on the Sumdorongchu incident, which does look at the grazing, the rights of the graziers and how they have impacted our border claims and our, how we have dealt with our borders through grazing claims and so on. Mm-hmm. So, I think that book might offer some shed some light on this, is what I mean to say.
Well, we're looking forward to that. Is there any other questions which anybody would like to raise their hands and make any or comment? I don't see any.
Also, even on
yes.
maybe even Ambassador Kanta, if he'd like to say something on this new MOU.
Yes.
We'd be interested to hear, or if you could shed some light on it, Ambassador.
Well, I'm afraid I don't. I've not been updated. I've read two. In fact, some of the best questions which some people who have been posted in Bhutan have more or less shared their views, and they seem to suggest basically what you have said. That is, this thing would have been more or less in the normal course. And the Indian side would have been aware of the general sort of drift of things, and they had probably been from time to time they have been in the picture. There is no reason to think that anything particularly shady is happening. I think this is part of the normal process, and I think it is in a sense. Perhaps it is true that the Chinese may be interested in trying to push them further into some kind of a definitive response that would be expected from them. On the other hand, the recent posturing that they've been doing on the border will only add to a certain amount of not alarm, but a certain amount of anxiety on the part of the Bhutanese negotiators. And perhaps also a kind of a caution not to want the situation to be aggravated, and therefore to try and proceed in terms of the discussion between the two in a manner which at least keeps things in a dialogue mode and not get aggravated further. And that I think is perfectly understandable from my own point of view, as it were. Now, I don't know if there is anybody who would like Ashok, would you like to comment?
Yes.
No, I agree with you, sir, that, I'm sure the Indian side was kept informed about these developments. We don't have details of the MOU, so really we don't know what's this 3-step process the MOU talks about. But one doesn't, as you said, no, there's nothing particularly shady about this MOU.
Yeah. Now, there are two questions. One from Dr. Ambuj Thakur, who asks how effective was Major Khating's military mission to Tawang in 1951 for India, and is for India legally admissible in India's claim on the region vis-a-vis China. Now, that is one question. And Nirmal Panda asks a question of China's claim to Tawang. How do you see China's claim to Tawang vis-a-vis the latest border treaty? There's no border treaty signed between Bhutan and China, but between the latest border discussions and the MOU between Bhutan and China.
I'll take the second question first to say that, China's claim on Tabang vis-a-vis the border, the MOU, I think, I don't think that the two are connected, except in terms of the timing, because, the Ladakh issue is on the boil, and therefore, it serves their purpose to sort of make it look slightly embarrassing for India. I don't think there's any connection between Tawang and that at all, in my view. As for Bob Khating's military mission, so I don't know what you mean by legally admissible. But, occupation of an area is 9/10 of your claim. We are in Tawang, and Bob Khating made it possible for us to be there. And that's where we're going to stay. So, given the political parameters which talk about settled populations, the settled populations certainly seems to indicate that Tawang should remain with India. So to that extent, yes, his mission did make it even more legally admissible. Now, for the last 70 years, it has been administered by India. We have documentary proof of that. And therefore, the settled population of Tawang belongs to India.
It's very interesting that virtually everything you say about the eastern sector, or much of what you say of the eastern sector, is applicable mutatis mutandis on the other side, in the western sector, because there is an effective occupation that side too. So in some ways, that actually begs the question, which has been, in a sense, haunting many people across in both countries, that there was in 1960 a very sensible kind of suggestion made, and subsequently also a very eminently practical suggestion made before the Rajiv Gandhi visit in 1988.
And up to 79.
Yes, exactly, 79. But even it was in fact also, in a sense, indirectly raised even during the RG visit. So all these things at that time seemed to be politically so difficult. And now, in a sense, it appears as if all these have suddenly become now, in a sense, sideswept, and a totally different situation is being faced, where we are, in a sense, on the back foot, or at least seem to be placed on the back foot.
But the trauma of 62, I think, was contributed to some of our reactions.
Yes. No, well, I suppose it did, but it's probably even before that. It was the politicization of the white papers, etc., which made it very difficult for any discussion to take place. I noticed that Patricia would like to speak, so I think we would give the floor to Patricia to make her question, because she says she tried to articulate it a little more in a slightly more, let's say, indirect manner. Would she like to speak now?
From her. Yes.
Yes, the host has now allowed me to unmute myself. Good. Thank you very much. Yes, I apologize for the fact that in advance I sound rather incoherent, but what I've been looking at very carefully in the last few weeks or so is fieldwork reports that my husband did in northern Afghanistan, in the region of the Panjshir and Andarab valleys, among Tajik-speaking people. And looking at this, one can say, I mean, we're still quite a distance from the Tibetan region, perhaps, but one can see really interesting questions that seem to be common to people of the Himalayas right across into this region of Afghanistan, where people are looking into connections with Central Asia, actually. Mm-hmm. And many of the things that are in common that strike one is first the juxtaposing of administrative first of all, the geographical limitations of these areas. There are natural valleys and there are passes. And passes are usually unpassable during the winter, and the valleys have their own social life and integrity per se. So the geography has its own logic, which one needs to take into account. And the geography is also connected with political administrations historical and contemporary, how they are limited and how they are defined and who is there. But a very important part of this seems to be trading routes or traditional trading routes, which go beyond the actual enclosure of valleys, which are independent by themselves or now within national frontiers, and where frontiers seem to be completely permeable as goods travel to and fro over the passes in the summer months. So the idea, when we were looking at his material, we found that there are nucleated villages, things that you could call a village. There are sets of homesteads surrounded by high walls in the valley, and there are bazaars which have their caravanserai and their, in this case, mosques, for travelers traveling to and fro right into Central Asia. So and along with this, sorry, can I continue?
Yes.
Along with this comes the sort of ethnographic or racial mixturing that goes on, and the linguistic pluralism, where pluralism is a fact of life. You described these boys speaking. And again, one was seeing along these trading routes in particular, these things happening. And then networks of patrilineages, of final marriage contacts, and of people expanding and building up power within valleys and marrying across valleys and establishing political contacts that way. So, and some people have, people who work on mountain societies per se are even suggesting that there's a lot of commonalities when you get above 10,000 feet altitude, or 8 to 10,000 feet. There are a lot of things that are in common. And again, the pasturing of animals is very important. The, activities from the plains right through the hills, hunting as a way of life, and so on. So this was just a remark that you have dealt so beautifully, and, one is really very, very taken with the absolute detail that you have, historical and geographic detail that you've come up with, and at the same time reminded of his commonalities in history, social structure, and social process. And that includes, of course, between Buddhist peoples particularly and Muslims also living in the highlands. Mm-hmm. So this was just a comment based on stuff I've been reading lately from field work done in Afghanistan in the late 50s and early 60s.
Thank you. It really brought it back to life.
Thank you. Yes, Patricia, that's very interesting that you mentioned this, because the midpoint, almost as it were, of this thing which you talk about, the Panjshir and the Andhra valleys, and the midpoint is actually Ladakh, where it, in fact, in a sense, where it meets the Muslim and the Buddhist influence meet, and that has been dealt with by Kyle Gardner so beautifully in his book, The Frontier Complex, and it gives a whole series of interesting kind of details. And this, in some ways, this logic, the logic of geography, the logic of political, administrative, and historical, as well as contemporary sort of interactions between people, trading routes, as well as the social, cultural kind of interactions that take place. Ultimately, those are what actually set the undergirding, as it were, for political, for understandings of where the political frontier ends, of one kind of people end and the others begin. And the whole question of the borders as linkages rather than barriers, as bridges rather than barriers, becomes very, very germane. But the trouble is here at a situation, when you have a situation where there is really now contestation, even prior, even as in a sense, the contestation is built into the situation, the political situation between countries. And that is where now much of the argumentation, much of the research, much of the collection of data is based on emphasizing where the differentiation is and how we actually differ rather than how they are connected. And that, I think, has become a bit of a problem. And I think this will probably continue to devil the kind of the discussions. And it's only after you have a kind of an agreement that you can look at the question of bridge building, because they're between the peoples. Because as long as it is there, there is a difference, and there is a larger contestation between the two bigger countries on both sides of the Himalayas. It's going to be very difficult for us to think in terms of being able to stress the linkages so easily, because we'll have to think more in terms of where we can draw a practical line of demarcation that sets one's kind of house, that limits one's borders from the other. And I think this is where I've always felt that it is really that kind of an approach which we had in the early part of the discussions on the boundary, perhaps even slightly before and after the Rajiv Gandhi visit, that actually set some parameters for that, settled populations and things like that, 2005. And I think there is really no moving away from that kind of a situation as far as I can see. I don't know if there are any further There's a question from Mukesh Kumar Varma. Mukesh Kumar Varma. Yes, what is the importance of Tawang for the PLA that in the early initial peace talks they thought of exchanging Western sector? I think would you like to attempt to answer that?
I can have a go. Basically to say that, the importance of Tawang has come into being, I think it gained currency in China in the early 80s. One of the theories, and others can contribute to this question, to the answer to this question, that in the early 80s, some documentary proof was found in China, perhaps to bolster their claim of Tawang, or it could be a maximalist position to settle the boundary because to move it from our claim line of Thagla to Hathungla, and therefore to take the maximalist position of wanting Tawang. These are only theories that I can hazard. But apart from that, I don't have any more definitive idea. But maybe others like Ambassador Nambiar and Ambassador Kanta, who've been part of negotiations, may be able to throw light on it.
But let me just say that from the military point of view, I don't see why the PLA would have any particular view about the importance of Tawang for the PLA. In the larger question of the military, the exchange of the Western sector and Eastern sector, that is understandable even from the point of view of the military. But the military dispositions and the importance of say, the Western sector vis-a-vis the Eastern sector. But in terms of the importance of Tawang, I would rather say that the question of Tawang has been discussed in detail on the Indian side in terms of the military dispositions, what the importance of it would be, how the defensibility and things like that have been talked about in much detail. But I'm not sure what the PLA, how the PLA would look at it, except in terms of their own experiences after the Wangdong incident, and that. Sumdarong Chu, you would be probably doing a fair amount of research, and you will probably be getting some amount of information, perhaps data from Chinese sources about how the PLA looked at the Sumdarong Chu Valley. There too, for a long time, there was a stalemate, as you know, at the Hathungla, Lungrola, and the Sulula kind of the passes, and then that remained for several years, under discussion, and there was virtual kind of a log jam, but eventually it got sorted out. And I think that kind of a thing you will understand. I'm sure that there will be discussions with the PLA, but I'm not aware of any larger discussion or any material that I have not come across any material from the PLA to discuss, to specifically claim any military reason for asserting claims on Tawang.
I'll just say that Colonel Venkat sent me a message which adds to what I had spoken about. He says that the Monpas of Zimithan have their traditional pilgrimage areas west of the India-Bhutan border. And according to them, they were part of their traditional sort of religious areas that they visited. So that's another point to suggest linkages between the two.
Oh, okay.
And I thought Mishi may be able to.
Yes, Mishi might be. Mishi was saying that she has a comment to make on from the personal point of view from Hong Kong, the Hong Kong perspective. Would you like to speak, Mishi?
I have to say it's so nice to see everybody, and it is so nice to listen to an actual discussion about actual history and to feel that somebody is listening to people on the ground and cow herders or the yak herders perhaps, and their viewpoints and how they feel. But I have to say my own view is rather pessimistic. I mean, sitting in Hong Kong, we are, the Hong Kong is a part of China, of course. We're a special administrative region of China governed by an international treaty that's registered with the UN, which is supposed to be, one country, two systems until 2047. But here we are in COVID with this essentially 3-week quarantine. It's like a cordon sanitaire that has been thrown around Hong Kong. And for all intents and purposes, we are prisoners of China. I mean, this quarantine was set up as a sort of under COVID, as a health measure. But I have come to see it as something far more sinister. And when my mother actually forwarded me the clip, which I've just put in, from Praveen Soni about Ladakh and AI and artificial intelligence. And I have to say something about that really resonates with me, with, just seeing how China is operating. I think these discussions of, which herders have which cultural links, they're so heartwarming. I'm so happy to hear them, but I fear they're of very little consequence in Beijing. These are just niceties, honestly speaking, politically speaking. And I fear that China's agenda is far larger, it's far broader, and it's subterranean. And what we see discussed in over treaties and in discussions is not really what's happening. We don't really know what's happening. Sitting in Hong Kong, plugged into the China scene, we don't know what's happening. We don't know what political, shenanigans are going on in Beijing, who's winning, who's losing, who's under attack, who's not. The ramifications, I think, will become clearer only years and years later, the exact, what happened. And even now, I don't think. So all this to say is that I feel very pessimistic about that region. And I'm really happy that Sonia, you guys were able to go in there and talk to people. But my concern is that in the end, it will be of little consequence.
No, Mishi, thank you for this, for your comments, which are, as you said, have tangential bearing on this. It is to some extent. I would like to think that the position in Tawang, the reality of the position is that it is still very much part of Arunachal Pradesh, and therefore the problems that we will encounter in terms of the pressures which are being exerted from across the border from across the line of actual control on the Tibetan side will be a problem. But as far as I can see, some of your comments will have to be borne in mind by us. But I am not quite so pessimistic in terms of the situation there. I personally feel that it should, that both in terms of the control of the actual situation and in terms of being able to handle any future discussion, negotiation, particularly in terms of the eastern sector, I don't see that we shall be found wanting in terms of a determination to be able to hold on to the kind of positions we have been holding on. So I think let me reassure you on that count, at least as far as I can see now. Obviously, what you are saying is important because you can see some of that thing being exercised or being experienced mutatis mutandis in Xinjiang, and you probably inside Tibet too, maybe. But I think these are things which I'm sure will evolve in time, and I'm sure that that even in China there is a much harder realization of the realities of how they can cope with it. Obviously, there is also a sense of determination and perhaps even ruthlessness in terms of how they deal with it. They would have to deal with it, but I think the world is in flux. There is a lot of things happening all around, and I think that they will be as keen as any other government to be able to get the larger focus on stability and a kind of particularly in the context of the Western sectors now in China, there are major pressures which are emanating both from Afghanistan and Myanmar, which they'll have to actually address. They'll have to address very, very carefully. And I'm sure that they are addressing it. My only hope is that they address it in a manner that will bring, as you said, cowherders and shepherds and the nomadic tribes and peoples. Their interests also are taken a little closer and a little more carefully into account. I'm sure that will happen.
It's a fervent hope that you are right, Ambassador.
Okay. Sonia, any comments to offer?
I'm good. I think I have said enough and more.
I don't know if there's anybody else who would like to make any further comment on...
Ambassador, there's a question from Mr. Varun Sharma.
Varun Sharma. Okay, yeah, I see this. Mr. Varun Sharma says China's expression of colonialism and cultural suppression in Ningxi, Tibet, has laden India and Bhutan monasteries of protection and development of Tibetan culture. I think this is the question. Would Sonia like to answer this? Like to respond to it?
Has laden India and Bhutan monasteries of
protection and development. What kind of a response can the India and Bhutan monasteries what kind of response can they make with regard to protection and development of Tibetan culture, facing the cultural suppression that you see across the border?
I think in Bhutan, there is, I don't think they are at all interested in preserving the Tibetan culture. I think that there is a great interest in Bhutan in remaining distinct from the Tibetan culture. And they would not like to be confused because, they have been an independent state for over 400 years. And so they are not really interested in preserving, or they have their own culture, which has its influences from Tibet. And they work very hard, very closely, and very sincerely, with great honesty to preserve that culture. And it's thriving, it's doing very well there. In India, there is an effort by the Tibetan community, which is supported. We have the Ganden, Sera, Drebung monasteries near Mysore in Karnataka. We have tried to create craft centers in India to preserve some of those, their trade, their old crafts. So some of that is being done, but a lot of it is being destroyed because within Tibet, which is the homeland of these crafts and these monasteries. And the art actually, because it was a theocratic state, it thrived in the monasteries. And so with those going away or going under the communist rule, I'm afraid there is no accounting for what might have done, but at least a small contribution has been made by India in preserving, in whatever Tibetan culture is being preserved, it is being preserved in India for the most part.
Tell me, Sonia, one point, and that is, there is still a considerable following of the Red Hat the sect in Tibet, I presume. How does that compare with the Red Hat traditions in Bhutan? And will there be a time where you may find kind of a contestation between the two for in a sense, for hegemony over the sect as a whole? Do you think that can presumably happen in the future?
No. My sense is, and I may be wrong, that era of theocratic states has passed. So now the polity is less it's not an ecclesiastical rule at all in any of these countries. So although they remain very staunchly Kagyu, the Drukpas or the people of Bhutan, I don't think that in Bhutan there is any expansionist sentiment that I have come across in my study at all. So I think they will continue to exist.
But you don't think that they will be either be subject to any pressure from across the border in Tibet, from the Drukpa sect? Though, of course, the head of the Drukpa sect has actually now has himself moved over, and he's probably returning to India. Maybe he's now in the United States, I understand, isn't it?
Yes. So I don't think that Bhutan could be really threatened. I think China wishes to use Bhutan to embarrass us occasionally, but not really to threaten it for itself. It would seem really churlish on its part to threaten such a small country.
Okay. Now, I don't see any more. Is there any further, Venkat, if there is any further question?
Sir, no question, sir.
There's one, you said 2 institutions, one in Norbulinka Institute in Dharamshala. This is what he has already mentioned. Yes. Okay. Well, I don't see how I can, in a sense, make any summation or sum up what has been said by Sonia. She said it. She's actually said in such considerable detail, and we have actually got a sense, a series of rather disparate questions that flow from that. But I think the main point you've mentioned, that namely that of the cross linkages between Tawang and Bhutan as being every bit as politically important and relevant, and perhaps in the future significant as those that link Tawang to Tibet. Of course, there is the religious aspect and the unambiguous linkage which Tibet has always had in the past with the Tawang monastery and with the ecclesiastical kind of developments inside Tawang. But that apart, I think in terms of looking at the present and the future, there are very distinct connections, even historical connections, which are as relevant with countries like Bhutan, which are at least as relevant as those which we see with Lhasa and Tibet. That can perhaps be the only big point which I can make in summing up. And I'd like to thank you, Sonia, for this wonderful kind of tour d'horizon you've given of the linkages between Tawang and Bhutan and the kinds of questions that they have generated. I don't know if there is anybody else who would like to make any comment at this stage, closing comments. Would there be anybody? If not, I think I shall call an end to this discussion, shall I? Sonia, is there anything you would like to say?
No, it only remains for me to thank you for hosting it so knowledgeably and wonderfully.
Okay.
And for everybody who attended, thank you very much.